On April 28, 1945, a scene of incredible fury played out in Milan, Italy. The bodies of the executed dictator, Benito Mussolini, and his mistress were brought to a public square. Upon seeing the corpse of the man who had ruled them with an iron fist, the crowd went absolutely wild. They spat on him, they kicked him, they beat his body until it was almost unrecognizable. They stomped on his head with such hatred that by the time they were done, it was virtually flat. This is what can happen when a nation's patience with a tyrant finally breaks. One of the territories that Mussolini had ruled over was Libya, and the Libyans knew a thing or two about oppressive rule. Now, fast forward 66 years to Libya in 2011. The country was in the grip of the Arab Spring, a massive wave of revolt sweeping across the region. For 42 years, Libyans had been ruled by their own eccentric and brutal dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, and just like the Italians with Mussolini, they had finally had enough. A few months into the rebellion, with the country engulfed in civil war, Gaddafi was on the run, aided by American intelligence and a French airstrike that blasted his 80-car entourage off the road. He was flushed out of hiding and found cowering in a drainpipe. The rebels, who found him, dragged him out into an open area, beating him all the way, and the entire time, someone was recording it on a cell phone. If you've ever seen that footage, you know there could not have been a more frightened-looking man on the planet. He pleaded for his life, repeating an Arabic phrase, haram Allah, meaning shame on you, but it's also a desperate plea to be spared. His pleas were ignored. The shot that finally killed Gaddafi was reportedly fired by a young man wearing a New York Yankees baseball cap. How the mighty had fallen. Both Mussolini and Gaddafi had once been wildly popular. They were seen as saviors, as men of the people who would usher in a new era of national pride and prosperity. So how does a man go from revolutionary hero to a terrified figure pulled from a drainpipe, beaten and killed by his own people? To understand that, we have to go back to the very beginning. Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi was born in 1942, which is ironically the very last year of the Italian occupation of his country. Throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Libya was a desperately poor nation, and Gaddafi himself was a Bedouin, a member of the nomadic groups famous around the world for their incredible ability to survive in one of the harshest climates on Earth, the Sahara Desert. Life for Gaddafi and his people was exceedingly hard, not just because of the climate, but because many of the non-Bedouin people of North Africa looked down on them. They saw the Bedouin as poor, ignorant animal herders, barely more intelligent than the livestock they owned. But in one way, Gaddafi was lucky. Unlike many other Bedouin boys his age, who were needed to help their families and were often forbidden from getting an education, he had the opportunity to attend tribal schools. This set him on a different path. In his late teens, he was accepted into the Royal Military Academy, and upon graduating, he did two very important things. First, he rose through the ranks to become a captain. And second, he secretly formed a group of like-minded officers called the Free Officers Movement. This wasn't just some social club. The Free Officers Movement was an Arab nationalist and Nasserist movement. Nasserist was the term used to describe followers of the charismatic Egyptian leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser had a grand vision of a single powerful Arab empire that would span all of North Africa and the Arab Middle East. His ideas were incredibly influential at the time, and one of the core tenets of Nasserism was the overthrow of all the old Arab monarchies and governments. They were to be replaced with so-called republics, which in country after country soon turned into one-party dictatorship. This was the path taken in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein eventually took over, and in Syria, where Hafez al-Assad, the father of the recently deposed Bashar al-Assad, began his own brutal rule. Throughout his early military career, Gaddafi was deeply involved in this world of pan-Arab political thought and secret revolutionary movements. He was widely regarded by his peers as extremely intelligent, but also a bit eccentric, a bit of a strange guy. But underneath that eccentricity, he was absolutely ruthless. And at the age of just 27, he led a bloodless military coup against Libya's king, King Idris I, who had governed the country since the Italians were kicked out. Now, he could have promoted himself to general or field marshal, making himself the supreme leader right away. But Gaddafi was clever. He only raised his rank by 2 steps. To colonel, and that's how he would be known for the rest of his life. To most people in Libya and around the world, Colonel Gaddafi. It sounded more humble, more like a man of the people. And in the beginning, it worked. Like so many other leaders who come in and overthrow an unpopular regime, Gaddafi was initially seen in Libya, especially in the capital, Tripoli, as a vibrant, intelligent, and charismatic young leader. He was a breath of fresh air, and like most other future dictators, he promised a new golden age. He promised Arab nationalism, peace, economic equality for all, prosperity, and of course freedom. But it didn't take long for the people of Libya to learn that anyone who disagreed with his vision, or more specifically, his path to that vision, was in very deep trouble. And in the early 1970s, he published his Green Book. He chose green because it's the traditional color of Islam, which was likely a political move, since Gaddafi always seemed to give lip service to Islam rather than having any genuine belief. The Green Book was a bizarre collection of his thoughts. It contained comments on Islam that were far from mainstream teachings, but they weren't fundamentalist either. It was a strange combination of Islamic beliefs, criticism of religious leaders, and Gaddafi's own strange philosophies on life and politics. Throughout his reign, he would intimidate and use clerics to push his own strange theories. Every single Libyan was told they had to memorize the Green Book. This was a particular challenge, as at the time, many of them couldn't even read. Of course, it wasn't really expected that everyone would know the whole thing, but it was always a good idea to have a few key phrases memorized and ready to go, just in case you were questioned by the police or a government official, because if they chose to, Gaddafi's police could jail someone almost indefinitely on the pretext that they didn't know the Green Book well enough, which was a pretty terrifying, open-ended threat. The Green Book spelled out Gaddafi's political ideology, which he called the Third International Theory. The other two, in his mind, were capitalism and communism. Gaddafi's theory called for Libya to be run as a direct democracy, with local people's committees running everything at both the local and national level. Of course, while these committees were supposed to be chosen by a vote, in reality, they were just populated by men, and occasionally women, which angered conservative religious groups who were loyal to Gaddafi and only Gaddafi. At the highest level, it was just Gaddafi's yes-men running the country and crushing any and all opposition. Very quickly, Libyans learned that the main point of Gaddafi's Third International Theory was keeping Gaddafi in power forever. Soon people who were even rumored to have spoken against the colonel started disappearing from the streets of Libya's bigger cities, like Tripoli and Benghazi. Before long, Libya had a new official name, the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. The closest English translation for Jamahiriya is republic, but it has other meanings, often used to describe the masses or the people. But here's the thing, almost no dictator can stay in power for long unless they give the people at least some of what they promised. And in the first decade or so of his rule, Gaddafi delivered. Many Libyans were willing to overlook the human rights abuses that were starting to creep in, because for the first time in their lives, important aspects of their lives were actually getting better. Gaddafi started a program of free healthcare and free education for everyone. He used government funds to subsidize housing and provide food for the poor. He brought electricity to parts of the country that had never had it. Most of this money came from Libya's oil industry, which he promptly nationalized, kicking out the Western companies that had controlled it for years. In the first half of his rule, living standards for most Libyans genuinely improved, and for a while the colonel enjoyed a period of real, actual popularity. But as time went on, things started to rot from the inside. Corruption on a grand scale began to permeate every level of Libyan society. Libya's oil wealth, while not on the same level as Saudi Arabia or Iraq, was more than enough for Gaddafi, his family, and his inner circle to enjoy a life of unbelievable luxury. He became one of the richest men in the region, if not the world. But as Gaddafi and his cronies got richer and richer, the funds for his grand social projects began to dry up. Many projects were left half-finished, or never even began, as the money and equipment just seemed to disappear. One project, however, was a massive success: the Great Man-Made River Project. This was an incredible feat of engineering that tapped into a vast, ancient freshwater aquifer deep beneath the Sahara deserts. The project built a massive underground network of pipes and aqueducts to bring that water to the cities. As you can imagine, bringing more water to people in a desert country was extremely popular, and it's still one of the largest projects of its kind in the world. But even that project began to suffer from corruption and neglect towards the end of his rule. As time went by, things began to change for Gaddafi himself. He became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. His intelligence and his cunning were never in question, but his judgment often was. In the late 1970s, as hard economic times hit the world, and as the corruption in Libya spread, more and more Libyans began to protest and complain about his policies. By this time, Gaddafi's secret police, known as the Mukhabarat, had infiltrated all levels of Libyan society. They were everywhere, especially in the cities, and especially among college students and young adults. And in the last years of the 1970s, Gaddafi began to commit some of the worst crimes of his rule. To instill fear in the population and intimidate anyone who might think of opposing him, he started holding public executions in the cities and towns where they took place. Attendance was mandatory, even for school children. The secret police and the military would be in the crowds, making sure that everyone was shouting Gaddafi's name or chanting quotes from the Green Book. In Tripoli especially, these executions became huge, terrifying public spectacles. They were often held in sports stadiums and on university campuses, places of community and learning, turned into theaters of death, and they were televised. In 1984, the country witnessed one of the most infamous of these events. A student named Sadiq Hamed Shawasti was hanged on live television after being dragged before a kangaroo court. Also on live TV, a handcuffed and terrified Shawasti sat and cried and begged for his life, as the court labeled him an agent of America and, bizarrely, an agent of the radical fundamentalist Muslim Brotherhood. Two polar opposites. He was also accused of plotting against Gaddafi. None of it was true. Shawasti's real crime was that he had visited the U.S. as a student and had attended an anti-Gaddafi protest there. That sealed his fate. His trial took place in a basketball stadium, where the judges, the witnesses against him, and even members of the audience, jeered at him and accused him of more and more outrageous crimes. A makeshift gallows was quickly thrown together on the basketball court, and Shuaidi was hanged. Now, as anyone familiar with the process can tell you, an efficient hanging is a relatively quick death, but if it's done wrong, it can take a very long, very painful time. As Shuaidi dangled from the rope, choking to death on live TV, one of Gaddafi's infamous female bodyguards, a woman known as Huda the executioner, actually hung from Shuaidi's legs until his neck finally broke, to the applause of the crowd. Hangings like this were broadcast all the time, sometimes live, sometimes after the fact. They were often rebroadcast on the state-controlled TV channels, frequently interrupting other programs at random, just to remind people who was in charge. Gaddafi's secret police were known throughout the Arab world for their cruelty. People in their custody were subjected to a horrifying variety of torture, including electric shock, waterboarding, mock executions, and brutal beatings. They were also infamous for a type of torture known as falanga, or bastonado, where the soles of a person's feet are beaten with a rod. It sounds less severe than electrocution, but it grows from painful to agonizing, very, very quickly. Women and girls who were taken into custody were often subject to rape, long prison sentences, or they would sometimes just disappear, never to be seen again. In late June of 1996, a protest broke out at the notorious Abu Salim prison in Tripoli. The prisoners were protesting a cut in their food rations that had been imposed after two men had escaped. The day after the protest began, soldiers and police entered the prison grounds and just started shooting and throwing grenades into the crowds of prisoners. Over 1,200 prisoners were killed. By this point, Gaddafi, who for a very brief time had been popular in some Western circles when he first took power, had become a sworn enemy of the established world order. Beginning in the 70s and continuing almost until the day he died, he provided huge amounts of money and weapons to some of the world's most well-known terrorist and militant organizations. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Irish Republican Army, and the Italian Communist Red Brigades all enjoyed regular infusions of cash and weapons from Libya, But despite his appalling human rights record at home, for many people in the West, Gaddafi was often dismissed as a sort of cartoon villain, a madman ruling a remote desert country. But in 1988, that changed forever. 2 years earlier, a bomb had exploded at the La Belle Disco in West Berlin, a popular hangout for U.S. servicemen. The bomb killed 3 people and injured many more. Investigations by the German and U.S. governments put the blame squarely on Gaddafi and his intelligence forces. A few days later, U.S. President Ronald Reagan ordered airstrikes on Libya. Several civilians were killed in those strikes, including, reportedly, Gaddafi's own adopted daughter. Then, on December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103, flying over Lockerbie, Scotland on its way to New York, exploded in midair. Debris and human remains rained down on the small Scottish town. All 70 people on the plane and 11 people on the ground were killed. In many ways, the bombing of Pan Am 103 began the final downfall of Gaddafi, even though his end was still over 2 decades away. From 1988 until 2011, American, British, and French air forces would occasionally strike targets in Libya. Tough economic sanctions were imposed, and slowly but surely, weapons began to find their way into the hands of the small but growing anti-Gaddafi movements inside the country. One of the last times many Americans saw Gaddafi before his death was in 2009. Even though he was a proven terrorist, the U.S. had to let him into the country for a UN meeting. No hotel in New York would give him or his entourage a room, so he proposed erecting the large, luxurious Bedouin tent he had brought with him right in the middle of Central Park. New York authorities, unsurprisingly, refused to grant him a permit. Then, Gaddafi was saved from this embarrassing situation by a New York real estate mogul and self-promoter named Donald Trump, who rented Gaddafi space on land he owned in nearby Bedford, New York. But after a couple of days, the local town council ordered the tent taken down. 2 years later, that same man was pulled from a drainpipe and killed by a mob. And that was the fate of Gaddafi. A brutal end for a brutal ruler. A final, bloody chapter in a story that began with promises of a golden age and ended in a dusty ditch in the Libyan desert.